There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary, their edges softened by the dim light of 3 in the morning, their true weight obscured by the mundane architecture of a hallway in a shared apartment. They don't announce themselves with thunder or revelation. They come as a whisper from a darkened doorway, a question so simple and so strange that it rearranges the very furniture of your soul. For me, that moment was the sound of my own name, spoken by a voice I knew better than the rhythm of my own pulse, a voice frayed with exhaustion and a vulnerability he never showed the waking world. Liam stood there, a silhouette against the deeper black of his bedroom, his frame, usually so solid and sure, seeming to waver in the space between us. The floorboards were cool beneath my bare feet, a grounding sensation in a world that was suddenly tilting on its axis. He had said he couldn't sleep, a common enough complaint in the pressure cooker of our mid-20s lives. But then came the rest, the part that unraveled me. He asked if hearing my voice would help. And in that question, I felt the terrifying, beautiful shift of a tectonic plate deep beneath the surface of our friendship, a bond one had so carefully preserved, so diligently kept within its designated lines. It was a request for an anchor in the storm of his own mind, and he was asking me to be that anchor, unaware that for years, he had been the entirety of my ocean. We had met in the way so many people do in college, thrown together by a shared space and a common pursuit that demanded more of our bodies than our minds. The university pool was our sanctuary and our crucible, a blue-tiled world that smelled perpetually of chlorine and effort. I was there on a photography scholarship, my time split between the quiet solitude of the darkroom and the explosive, churning energy of the swim team. Liam was the opposite, a force of nature built for the water, a software engineering prodigy who seemed to process the world in clean, logical code while his body moved with an instinctive, fluid grace. He was all bright energy and easy laughter, the kind of person who collected friends like he collected accolades, effortlessly. I was quiet, an observer by nature and by trade. I watched things. I noticed the way the late afternoon light would catch the water droplets on his shoulders, turning them into 1,000 tiny prisms. I saw the exhaustion behind his eyes after a brutal practice, a shadow that his wide grin never quite managed to chase away. Our friendship was an unlikely algorithm, but it worked. It was forged in the shared exhaustion of 5 a.m. practices and the bleary-eyed camaraderie of late-night study sessions fueled by cheap coffee and pizza. He would help me with the calculus I needed for a physics of light class, explaining complex theorems with a patience that seemed at odds with his restless energy. In return, I became his sounding board, the quiet presence he could talk at for hours, untangling the complex logic of his code or the far more chaotic logic of his relationships. We fell into an easy rhythm that carried us beyond graduation and into this apartment, a space we chose together, a neutral territory where our disparate worlds could coexist. He filled it with the hum of his high-end computer and the scattered remnants of his active social life. I filled it with the chemical scent of developing fluid, the quiet rustle of photo paper, and the books that were stacked on every available surface. For my part, my feelings for him were a photograph I kept in a locked box, an image developed in the darkroom of my own heart. I had learned early on to compartmentalize that affection, to file it away under the heading of profound platonic friendship. It was a necessary act of self-preservation. Liam moved through the world with a casual, confident heterosexuality that was as much a part of him as his eye color. He dated. He fell in and out of love with a series of bright, lovely women, and I played my role as the supportive best friend. I listened to him talk about first dates and anxieties, about the thrill of a new connection and the eventual, inevitable fizzle of a flame burning out. I met his girlfriends, smiled, and made polite conversation, all while a quiet, persistent ache settled deep in my chest. It was the ache of the photographer who sees the perfect shot, the one that captures a truth so profound it could change everything, but knows he can never press the shutter. To do so would be to shatter the beautiful, fragile reality of the moment itself. So I watched, and I listened, and I kept my secret safe in the quiet, shadowed corners of our shared life. The great shift began not with a bang, but with the slow, grinding erosion of Liam's world. His relationship with Sarah, a 2-year saga of passion and conflict, finally crumbled under its own weight. It was an ugly breakup, a drawn-out war of attrition that left him hollowed out. I watched him go through the motions, his usual vibrant energy replaced by a muted, gray exhaustion. He would come home from work, his shoulders slumped, the bright spark in his eyes dimmed to a pilot light. Sarah had been a fixture, a central node in his network, and her absence left a gaping hole in his life, a void he didn't know how to fill. He tried, at first, to patch it with the usual things, more hours at the gym, nights out with mutual friends, burying himself in the intricate architecture of the software he was designing for a high-stakes project at his firm. But none of it worked. The fixes were temporary, flimsy patches on a structural wound. The stress from his job compounded the emotional fallout. He was leading a team for the first time, and the pressure was immense. He spoke of deadlines like approaching storm fronts, of bugs in his code like insidious diseases. He stopped sleeping properly. I'd hear him pacing in his room at all hours, the soft thud of his footsteps a restless metronome, counting out the seconds of the night. Sometimes, I'd find him in the kitchen at 4 a.m, bathed in the cold, sterile glow of the refrigerator light, staring blankly at the contents as if the answer to some complex problem was hidden behind the milk carton. He looked lost, a ship cut adrift from its moorings, tossed on a sea of his own making. And in his desperation, without ever saying it, without ever consciously choosing it, he began to drift towards my shore. It started small, as these things always do. A change in our established patterns, a subtle redrawing of the boundaries we had lived within for years. The ritual began on a Tuesday night, a particularly brutal one for him. He had come home late, smelling of stale office air and defeat. A critical server had crashed, wiping out a day's worth of his team's work. He didn't want to talk about it. Instead, he collapsed onto the couch, his long frame seeming to fold in on itself, and asked if we could watch a movie. Not one of the loud, explosive blockbusters he usually favored, but something quiet, something I would choose. We watched an old black-and-white film, its slow, deliberate pace a bomb in the charged silence of the room. I was acutely aware of him beside me, of the space between our shoulders, a gulf of a few inches that felt both vast and insignificant. Halfway through the film, his breathing deepened, evening out into the slow, steady rhythm of sleep. His head, which had been propped against the back of the couch, listed slowly, inevitably, to the side, until it came to rest on my shoulder. My entire body went rigid. It was such a simple, innocuous act, the kind of casual intimacy friends share without a second thought. But for me, it was a cataclysm. I could feel the warmth of him through the thin fabric of my shirt, the soft texture of his hair against my neck. I could smell the faint, clean scent of his shampoo. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, panicked bird trapped in a cage. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, every nerve ending firing, every sense heightened. I analyzed the weight of his head, the gentle puff of his breath, searching for meaning, for intent, when I knew, logically, there was none. It was just sleep. It was just exhaustion. But my heart, that foolish, traitorous organ, didn't care about logic. It cared only for the impossible, undeniable fact of his closeness. When the movie ended, the credits rolling in silence, I didn't move. I couldn't bring myself to wake him. He looked so peaceful, the deep lines of stress on his forehead smoothed away in sleep, his mouth slightly parted. For the first time in weeks, the restless energy that always surrounded him was gone, replaced by a profound stillness. He seemed younger, more vulnerable, stripped of the armor he wore for the world. I carefully reached for the Afghan draped over the armchair, the one my grandmother had knitted for me, and gently pulled it over him. My fingers brushed against his arm, and his skin was warm. He stirred, a soft murmur escaping his lips, and settled more deeply against me. I held my breath, waiting for him to wake, to realize the position we were in and pull away with a self-conscious laugh. But he didn't. He just slept. And I just sat there, in the flickering blue light of the television screen, the weight of his head on my shoulder feeling like both a benediction and a curse. That night became the blueprint for a new routine, a silent agreement we never verbalized. Movie nights on the couch became a regular occurrence. He would claim he was too tired to make it to his own bed, or that he just wanted the background noise to help him drift off. I never questioned it. I simply accepted this new, fragile intimacy. Each time it happened, The initial shock lessened, replaced by a quiet, humming tension, a constant state of hyper-awareness. I learned the specific cadence of his sleeping breath, the way his hand would sometimes twitch in a dream, the subtle shifts in his weight as he settled against me. The living room, once a shared, neutral space, became my territory, a stage on which this strange, ambiguous play was enacted nightly. And I, the quiet observer, was now a central character, a silent participant in a story whose plot I couldn't begin to understand. The couch was one thing, a space with a built-in plausible deniability. But then the boundaries began to dissolve further. His bedroom door, which had always been a firm, solid barrier, a symbol of his private, separate life, started to be left ajar. At first, it was just a crack, a sliver of light spilling into the darkened hallway. I would see it when I got up for a glass of water, and I would pause, my hand on the refrigerator door, listening to the silence. It felt like a question mark hanging in the air. Was it an oversight? A product of his exhaustion? Or was it something else? An invitation? A signal? I would stand there, paralyzed by the sheer volume of my own thoughts, my own hopes. The open door was a threshold, and I was terrified of what it might mean to even consider crossing it. Then, one night, the door was not just ajar, it was wide open. I came out of my room and saw him tangled in his sheets, his face illuminated by the faint moonlight filtering through his window. He was tossing and turning, caught in the grip of a dream I couldn't see. A low sound of distress escaped his lips. Without thinking, my feet carried me to his doorway. I stood there, my hand braced against the frame, my heart aching with a helpless surge of protective instinct. I wanted to go to him, to smooth the hair back from his forehead, to whisper that everything was going to be okay. But I was rooted to the spot, held in place by the invisible lines we had drawn around ourselves years ago. To cross that threshold uninvited felt like a fundamental transgression, a violation of the trust that was the bedrock of our friendship. So I just stood and watched until the storm in his sleep subsided and he settled back into a restless stillness. I returned to my own bed, but not to sleep. I lay awake, staring at my own ceiling, the image of his troubled face projected onto the blank canvas above me, a silent film of my own longing. The ritual of the couch continued, escalating in its intimacy. He no longer waited to fall asleep by accident. He would simply lie down, his head finding its now familiar place in my lap as I read or worked on my laptop. He would sigh, a sound of deep, weary contentment, and his hand would come to rest on my leg, his fingers loosely curled against the denim of my jeans. The first time he did it, I nearly stopped breathing. His touch was casual, unthinking, and yet it sent a jolt of electricity through my entire system. It was a simple, possessive gesture, a claiming of comfort, and it made my carefully constructed walls tremble. I would force myself to keep reading, to keep my breathing even, to act as if this was the most natural thing in the world. I became a master of feigned nonchalance, an actor giving the performance of a lifetime to an audience of one, an audience who was usually fast asleep and completely unaware of the turmoil he was causing. I lived in a state of constant, low-grade anxiety, a hum of tension beneath the surface of my skin. Every moment with him was a text to be deciphered, every gesture a clue to be analyzed. I was a detective in a mystery of my own making, searching for evidence to support a conclusion I was terrified to reach. Was this just what friendship looked like for him? Was he so comfortable with me, so secure in our platonic bond, that these acts of physical intimacy meant nothing more to him than leaning against a wall for support? Or was there something else stirring beneath the surface, a subconscious need he couldn't or wouldn't acknowledge? The ambiguity was a form of torture. It was a Schrodinger's cat of affection. As long as the box of our friendship remained closed, his feelings could be both platonic and something more, existing in a quantum state of uncertainty. To open the box, to ask the question, would be to force a reality, and I was terrified that the reality I found would be one of rejection, of a friendship shattered by the weight of my own unrequited feelings. So I existed in the gray space, in the quiet moments on the couch, in the charged silence of the hallway at night. I became fluent in the language of his nonverbal cues. I knew the specific kind of tired that meant he would seek me out, the slight downturn of his mouth, the way he would run a hand through his already messy hair. I learned to distinguish between the exhaustion that came from a long day at work and the deeper, soul-crushing weariness that came from his loneliness. On those nights, he would be quieter, his presence beside me heavier, more needy. He would press closer, his arm tucked against my side, his breathing a soft, warm presence against my neck. In those moments, it felt less like friendship and more like a form of mutual anchoring. I was his port in a storm, and he, without knowing it, was the very reason for my sea. The irony was a bitter pill I swallowed daily. He was coming to me to be healed from a loneliness I felt so acutely, a loneliness that was defined by my love for him. One evening, the ritual changed again. It was late, and a cold autumn rain was lashing against the windows, a relentless, percussive sound that seemed to amplify the quiet of our apartment. Liam was on the couch, and I was in the armchair, editing a set of photos from a recent shoot. He hadn't been able to settle, his restless energy palpable in the small space. He kept shifting, sighing, his gaze distant. Finally, he spoke, his voice quiet, almost lost beneath the sound of the storm. "My bed feels big." It was such a simple statement, but it landed in the room with the force of a confession. It was an admission of loneliness so pure and unadorned that it took my breath away. I looked up from my laptop, my own carefully guarded heart clenching in sympathy. I saw him not as the confident, capable man he presented to the world, but as a boy, lost and aching for a comfort he couldn't name. I didn't know what to say. The silence stretched, filled only by the drumming of the rain. "It's just empty," he added, his gaze fixed on the ceiling. I closed my laptop, the soft click echoing in the room. I wanted to tell him that I understood, that I knew the feeling of a space that is too large for one person, the way silence can have a physical weight. But the words wouldn't come. They were tangled up in all the things I couldn't say, all the truths I had to keep hidden. Instead, I stood up, walked to the linen closet, and pulled out the heavy down comforter we reserved for guests. I walked back to the couch and, without a word, unfolded it. He watched me, his eyes tracking my every movement. I sat down at the opposite end of the couch, leaving a deliberate space between us, and draped the comforter over my own legs. Then I looked at him, a silent invitation. He hesitated for only a second before shifting, moving down the couch to lie beside me, his head on the throw pillow next to mine. I pulled the comforter over both of us, creating a small, warm tent of shared space, a haven from the storm both outside and within. We lay there for a long time, side by side in the dim light, not touching, but close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from his body. We were two separate islands, but for the first time, we were sheltered under the same sky. He fell asleep within minutes, his breathing finally deep and even, and I lay awake for hours, listening to the rain and the sound of him sleeping, feeling the profound, painful, beautiful weight of it all. The night that everything changed was quiet, unlike the stormy one that had preceded our new arrangement of sharing the comforter. This night was still and cold, the kind of deep winter night where the city outside seems to hold its breath. The silence in the apartment was absolute, broken only by the low hum of the refrigerator. I was in my bed, reading, but the words on the page were just black marks, failing to cohere into any meaning. My mind was next door, in the living room, where Liam was asleep on the couch. He had come home late again, looking like a ghost, his face pale and drawn. He had mumbled something about a project deadline being moved up and had immediately collapsed, too tired even for our usual ritual of a quiet movie. I had covered him with the comforter and retreated to my room, leaving him to the peace he so desperately needed. But hours later, I heard a floorboard creak in the hallway. I lowered my book, listening. Another creak, closer this time. I knew it was him. I held my breath, my heart starting a slow, heavy drumbeat against my ribs. I heard him pause outside my door. The doorknob, a dark brass oval in the dim light from the hall, was still. The seconds stretched into an eternity. I was suspended in that moment, a photograph held in the developing fluid, waiting to see what image would emerge. I imagined him on the other side of the door, his hand raised, hesitating. What did he want? What was he doing? The uncertainty was a physical thing, a pressure building in my chest. Then, the sound of his footsteps retreated, and I heard the soft sigh of his own mattress as he climbed into his bed. A wave of something akin to disappointment washed over me. so sharp and unexpected that it made me flinch. I was angry at myself for the feeling, for the ridiculous hope that had flared in the silence. I tried to go back to my book, but it was useless. The apartment was no longer quiet. It was filled with the deafening sound of his presence in the next room, of his nearness, of the unspoken thing that hung in the air between us. After another half-hour of staring at the same page, I gave up. I swung my legs out of bed, the cold floor a shock to my system. I needed water, or air, or just a change of scenery from the four walls of my room, which suddenly felt like they were closing in. I moved silently, my steps practiced and light from years of navigating this space in the dark. As I passed his open doorway, I glanced in. I expected to see him sleeping, but he wasn't. He was lying on his back, his arm thrown over his eyes, a rigid line of tension in the set of his jaw. He was perfectly still, but it was the stillness of a man holding himself together by sheer force of will. My feet stopped of their own accord. I stood in the doorway, a silent sentinel, caught in the gravitational pull of his distress. "Alex." His voice was a raw whisper, so quiet I almost thought I had imagined it. It came from under his arm, muffled and rough. "Yeah," I whispered back. "I'm here." He didn't move his arm, but I saw his throat work as he swallowed. "You awake?" "I am now," I said, trying for a lightness I didn't feel. It fell flat in the heavy silence. "Sorry," he murmured. "Didn't mean to wake you, you didn't," I assured him, my voice still a whisper. I couldn't sleep either. We stayed like that for a long moment, him on the bed, me in the doorway, connected by a thin thread of whispered words in the dark. I could feel the chasm between us, the physical distance of the room, but also the vast, uncharted territory of everything we hadn't said. I should have just gone to the kitchen, gotten my water, and gone back to my room. It was the safe thing to do, the thing that would preserve the status quo. But I couldn't. My feet felt like they were nailed to the floor. Then came the words that I would replay in my mind 1,000 times, the words that would become the title of this chapter of my life. "I can't shut my brain off," he said, his voice strained. "It's just so loud in here." He tapped his temple with a finger from his other hand. "It's stupid. But would you just talk for a bit? I think hearing your voice would help." The request was so simple, so raw, so utterly disarming. He wasn't asking for advice or for a solution. He was asking for a sound. For my sound. He was asking for me to be the quiet melody that could drown out the chaotic noise in his own head. The trust in that request, the sheer, unvarnished vulnerability of it, cracked something open inside of me. The fear, the caution, the years of carefully maintained distance. It all just fell away, and all that was left was the overwhelming, uncomplicated need to give him what he was asking for. "Okay," I said, my own voice thick with an emotion I couldn't name. "Yeah, okay." I didn't enter his room. That still felt like too much, a line I wasn't ready to cross. Instead, I sank down to the floor, my back against the doorframe, my legs stretched out into the hallway. I was a fixture in the doorway, a liminal being in a liminal space. I could see him from the corner of my eye, a pale shape in the gloom. I tilted my head back against the wood and stared up at the dark ceiling. What do you say to a person in the middle of the night? What words can possibly be enough? I decided it didn't matter what I said, only that I said it. So I started to talk. I talked about the book I was reading, a dense history of early photographic processes. I described the way tintypes were made, the smell of the chemicals, the magic of an image slowly appearing on a metal plate. I spoke about the patience it required, the way you had to wait in the dark, trusting the process, trusting that the light you had captured would eventually reveal itself. My voice was low, a steady, quiet murmur, deliberately devoid of any strong emotion. I was weaving a blanket of sound, something to cover him, to keep him warm and safe from his own thoughts. I talked about a set of photos I was editing, a series of landscapes I had shot at the coast last month. I described the color of the sea just before a storm, the way the light turned a strange, metallic gray-green. I talked about the sound of the waves on the rocks, the salty taste of the air, the feeling of the wind on my face. I spoke for a long time, my voice growing softer, my words slowing down as I felt the tension in the room begin to dissipate. I could feel him relaxing, the rigid line of his body softening on the bed. His breathing, which had been shallow and tight, deepened, falling into a slow, easy rhythm. I risked a glance at him. His arm was no longer over his eyes. It was resting by his side, his hand open, palm up. His eyes were closed. His face, in the faint light, looked peaceful. He was finally asleep. A profound sense of relief washed over me, so potent it was almost dizzying. I had done it. I had given him what he needed. I had quieted the storm. I fell silent, letting the quiet resettle in the room. I listened to the sound of his breathing for a few more minutes, a steady, reassuring presence in the dark. It was time to go. I had served my purpose. Carefully, trying not to make a sound, I began to push myself up from the floor. My joints protested with a quiet creak. "Don't go," the voice was thick with sleep, but it was clear, and it stopped me cold. I froze, halfway to my feet, my hand braced against the doorframe. I looked over at him. His eyes were open, just slits in the darkness, but they were fixed on me. "Stay," he whispered. "Please," and that one word, that simple, desperate plea, was the final key. It unlocked the door I had been standing in front of for so long. The fear of transgression, of misinterpretation, of shattering our friendship, it all seemed insignificant in the face of his need. I couldn't leave him. I wouldn't. Slowly, I lowered myself back down, but this time, I moved through the doorway. I crossed the threshold. I walked the few steps to his bed and sat on the edge, my back to him, just wanting to be a solid presence in his room. The mattress dipped under my weight. He shifted behind me. I felt, more than saw, him move closer. A hand, warm and hesitant, touched my back. It rested there, between my shoulder blades, a point of searing heat. It wasn't a casual touch. It was a question. My breath hitched. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just waited. His fingers curled slightly, pressing into the fabric of my t-shirt. Then, he spoke again, his voice so close to my ear now that I could feel the warmth of his breath. "Alex," he said, and my name was a prayer, a confession. "Would it be okay?" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. I knew what he was asking, and I knew there was only one possible answer. I turned my head slowly, looking at him over my shoulder. His face was inches from mine, his eyes wide and dark and full of a terrifying, beautiful vulnerability. I saw my own reflection in them, a small, startled shape. I gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was all the permission he needed. He leaned in, closing the small gap between us, and his lips met mine. It was not a kiss of passion or of demand. It was a kiss of quiet discovery, tentative and soft, a question being asked in a language we were both just learning. It was the taste of salt and late-night exhaustion, of loneliness and a desperate, burgeoning hope. It was the sound of a lock finally, gently, clicking open. In the stillness of his room, with the city sleeping around us, a new world was being born, a world I had only ever allowed myself to dream of. And it was quiet, and it was real, and it was everything. The dawn that followed was a cruel architect, rebuilding the walls that had dissolved in the dark. I woke up first, a sliver of pale, gray light filtering through the blinds, slicing the room into stripes of shadow and illumination. I was in his bed, on top of the covers, my clothes still on. He was beside me, under the sheets, his back to me. The space between us felt like a mile-wide canyon. The memory of the kiss, of the moments that followed, a quiet, desperate clinging, a series of gentle, searching kisses that were more about comfort than desire, a final falling asleep with his hand loosely holding mine, felt like a dream, a fragile, beautiful thing that was already starting to evaporate in the morning light. I could feel the shift in the room's atmosphere. The intimacy of the night had been replaced by the stark, awkward reality of the morning after. I slipped out of his bed as quietly as I could, my movements stiff and uncertain. He didn't stir. I retreated to my own room, closing the door behind me with a soft click. I stood in the middle of my floor, my heart pounding a frantic, anxious rhythm. What had we done? What had I done? I had crossed the line, the one I had sworn to myself I would never cross. And now, I had no idea what came next. I showered and dressed in a haze, my mind replaying every second of the night, searching for clues, for confirmation that I hadn't imagined the raw vulnerability in his eyes, the desperate plea in his voice. But the memory was already becoming suspect, tainted by my own years of longing. Had I projected it all? Had I seen what I wanted to see in a moment of his weakness and loneliness? When I emerged from my room, the apartment was silent. His bedroom door was closed. Not ajar, not open, but firmly, definitively shut. It was a statement, a boundary re-erected. A door slammed in the face of the night we had shared. A wave of cold dread washed over me. I went to the kitchen and made coffee, my hands moving on autopilot. The familiar ritual was no comfort. Every sound, the grinding of the beans, the gurgle of the machine, seemed amplified, obscene in the tense silence. I heard the sound of his shower, a distant rush of water. I sat at the small kitchen table, nursing a mug of coffee I didn't want, and waited. He came out of his room a few minutes later, dressed for work. He didn't look at me. His movements were jerky, too quick. He grabbed a protein bar from the pantry, his back to me the entire time. The silence was a living thing, a suffocating presence in the room. I couldn't bear it. "Liam," I said, my voice sounding unnaturally loud. He froze, his hand on the doorknob. He turned, but he still wouldn't meet my eyes. His gaze was fixed on a point on the wall just over my shoulder. "I'm late," he said, his tone flat, devoid of any emotion. "Gotta run, Liam." "Wait," I said, standing up. "About last night." He finally looked at me, and his expression was a shuttered, guarded mask. The openness, the vulnerability from the night before, was gone, replaced by a panicked defensiveness. "Look, Alex," he said, cutting me off, his voice clipped and strained. I was exhausted. I wasn't thinking straight. It was a mistake. Let's just forget it happened, okay? A mistake. The word hit me with a physical force, knocking the air from my lungs. It was a clean, sharp blow, right to the center of my chest. A mistake. My years of carefully guarded hope, the fragile new world that had been born just hours before. He had just dismissed it all with a single, brutal word. I felt a cold, hollow sensation spread through me. I had been right to be afraid. I had misread everything. I had taken his desperation for affection, his loneliness for something more. I was a fool. I must have had some expression on my face, because a flicker of something, guilt, maybe, crossed his features before he stamped it out. He couldn't get out of the apartment fast enough. The door closed behind him with a decisive click, and I was left standing in the kitchen, the echo of his words ringing in my ears. A mistake. I sank back into my chair, the coffee in my mug now cold. The apartment, our home, suddenly felt like a foreign country, a place where I no longer knew the language or the customs. The silence he left behind was heavier, more profound, than any that had come before. It was the silence of an ending. The days that followed were a masterclass in avoidance. Liam became a ghost in our own apartment. He left before I woke up and came home long after I had retreated to my room. We communicated, when necessary, through brief, functional text messages. "Working late tonight. Don't wait up." The easy camaraderie we had shared for years vanished, replaced by a formal, painful politeness. The living room couch sat empty in the evenings. His bedroom door remained perpetually, resolutely closed. The warmth and life had been sucked out of our home, leaving behind a cold, sterile vacuum. I was adrift in a sea of hurt and confusion. His words, "It was a mistake," played on a loop in my head. I tried to convince myself that he was right, that it was for the best. I tried to rebuild the walls around my heart, to go back to being the quiet, observant friend. But it was impossible. Something had been broken, and I didn't know how to fix it. The ambiguity that had been a source of anxious hope was now gone, replaced by a certainty that was 1,000 times more painful. He didn't feel what I felt. It was that simple, and I had been foolish enough to let myself believe otherwise. I threw myself into my work, spending long hours in the darkroom, the acrid smell of chemicals a welcome distraction. I focused on the tangible, the physical process of creating an image from light and shadow. Here, at least, I had some control. I could adjust the exposure, dodge and burn, bring a desired reality into focus. But even here, he haunted me. I found myself looking for his likeness in the faces of strangers, seeing the curve of his jaw in a shadow, the intensity of his gaze in the eyes of a portrait subject. He was an overexposed image I couldn't wash away. After a week of this agonizing silence, I knew I couldn't go on. The not knowing had been torture, but this new, painful certainty was worse. It was a slow poison, seeping into every corner of my life. Living with him, with this giant, unspoken thing between us, was unbearable. It was ruining not just the fantasy I had harbored, but the real, tangible friendship that had been the most important relationship in my life. I would rather have his honest rejection than this hollow, aching silence. I had to know the truth, the whole truth, not just the panicked, dismissive words he had thrown at me in his haste to escape. I deserved that much. Our friendship deserved that much. That night, I didn't retreat to my room. I waited for him. I sat on the couch, the same couch where he had slept against me so many times, and I waited. The lights were dim, the apartment quiet. It was after midnight when I heard his key in the lock. The door opened, and he stepped inside, his shoulders slumped with a familiar exhaustion. He stopped short when he saw me, his body tensing. For a moment, I thought he might just turn around and leave. "Don't," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "Don't run away again, Liam." He closed the door slowly, his eyes wary. He didn't take off his coat. He stood there, a few feet away, a man poised for flight. "We need to talk," I said, my heart hammering against my ribs. "I can't do this. This silence. It's killing me." He ran a hand over his face, a gesture of pure, unadulterated weariness. "Alex, there's nothing to talk about. I told you. It was a mistake." "No," I said, shaking my head. "I don't believe you. I won't believe you. Not like this." I stood up, taking a step towards him, forcing him to meet my eyes. "That night, you weren't just tired, Liam. You were something else. You were open. You were honest. And what happened between us, it wasn't a mistake. It might have been confusing, it might have been scary, but it wasn't a mistake. And you do not get to cheapen it. You don't get to erase it because you're afraid." My words hung in the air between us, sharp and clear. I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Anger, fear, and something else, something that looked like desperation. He looked trapped. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice low, almost a growl. "You have no idea what's going on in my head, then tell me." I shot back, my own voice rising with a week's worth of frustration and pain. "For God's sake, Liam, just be honest with me. Is that too much to ask? After all these years, after everything? I'm not asking you to feel something you don't. I'm not asking for anything. I just need to know what was real. I need to know that I didn't just imagine it all. If you tell me, right now, to my face, that it meant nothing to you, that you felt nothing, then I'll let it go. I'll go back to being your friend, and we'll never speak of it again. But you have to say it. And you have to mean it." I stood before him, my chest heaving, my entire being braced for the final, killing blow. I had laid all my cards on the table. I had made myself completely, terrifyingly vulnerable. It was his move. He stared at me, his jaw clenched, his eyes warring with a storm of emotions I couldn't decipher. The silence stretched, taut and humming with 1,000 unspoken words. He opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked away, his gaze darting around the room as if searching for an escape route. But there was nowhere to go. There was only me, and there was only the truth. Finally, his shoulders sagged, the fight draining out of him in one long, shuddering exhale. He looked back at me, and the mask was gone. In its place was a raw, aching confusion that mirrored my own. "I can't," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I can't say it meant nothing," and with those 5 words, the dam inside him broke. "I can't say it meant nothing because it did," he continued, the words tumbling out of him in a rush, a torrent of confession. "It meant everything. In that moment, it was the only thing that felt real, the only thing that made sense." He finally moved, collapsing onto the armchair, burying his face in his hands. His voice was muffled, thick with unshed tears. "I'm so scared, Alex. I don't know what this is. I look at you, and I see my best friend, my rock, the only person I can be completely myself with. And that night, I looked at you, and I saw all of that, and I saw something more. And it terrified me, because I'm not supposed to feel this way." He looked up at me, his eyes shining with tears, his face a portrait of utter turmoil. "My whole life, I've had this map, this plan. I knew who I was supposed to be, who I was supposed to love. And you were a fixed point on that map, the capital of friendship, a place I could always navigate back to. But that night, it felt like the entire continent shifted. And now I'm lost. I don't have a compass anymore. I just know that when I'm falling apart, you're the only one who can put me back together. And I don't know what that makes me. And I don't know what that makes us." I listened to his confession, and the anger, the hurt, the week of agonizing uncertainty, it all just melted away, replaced by a wave of overwhelming, heart-stopping tenderness. He wasn't rejecting me. He was terrified. He wasn't running from me. He was running from himself, from a truth so profound it threatened to upend his entire world. I crossed the room and knelt in front of his chair, my hands coming to rest on his knees. He flinched at the contact, but didn't pull away. "Hey," I said softly, waiting until he met my eyes. "Look at me." His gaze was full of shame and fear. "You don't have to have a map," I told him, my voice gentle. "You don't have to have any of the answers right now. We can be lost together. Okay? We can just be here, in this. And we can figure it out, one step at a time. You don't have to be scared alone." A single tear escaped and traced a path down his cheek. He didn't wipe it away. He just looked at me, a silent, searching question in his eyes. I gave him a small, watery smile. "For what it's worth," I added, my voice barely a whisper, "I've been lost for a very long time, Liam. And for the first time, I don't feel so alone in it." He let out a shaky breath, a sound that was half sob, half laugh. He reached out, his hand hesitant, and cupped my cheek. His thumb brushed away a tear I hadn't even realized had fallen. His touch was no longer uncertain. It was a statement, a choice. "Okay," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Okay." Together, in the quiet of our apartment, surrounded by the wreckage of his fear and my hope, we began to build something new. Not on the old map, with its rigid lines and predetermined destinations, but in the uncharted territory we now found ourselves in, a landscape we would have to explore and define for ourselves. The silence between us was finally broken, and in its place was the beginning of a new conversation, one that was fragile and honest and terrifying and more beautiful than anything I had ever dared to imagine. That conversation lasted through the night and into the dawn. We didn't move from our spots, me on the floor, him in the chair. We just talked. We unspooled years of unspoken feelings, of misunderstood gestures, of quiet observations. I told him everything. I told him about the ache in my chest when he talked about his girlfriends, about the way I studied his face like a photograph I was trying to memorize, about the quiet, persistent hope I had buried so deep I had almost convinced myself it wasn't there. I laid my heart bare, exposing every vulnerable, hidden corner. And he didn't run. He listened, his gaze never leaving my face, his expression shifting from surprise to recognition to a dawning, profound understanding. He talked, too. He spoke of a loneliness that had been his constant companion, even when he was surrounded by people. He talked about feeling like he was always playing a part, the easygoing, confident guy, while inside he was a tangle of anxieties. He confessed that the comfort he found in my presence was something unique in his life, a quiet harbor he had come to depend on without ever understanding why. He admitted that the kiss, far from being a mistake, had felt like a moment of impossible clarity, a sudden, shocking recognition of a truth he had been subconsciously avoiding for years. The fear had come later, the panic of what it all meant for the identity he had so carefully constructed. He had pushed me away because he was terrified of the answer to the questions I made him ask himself. As the sun began to rise, casting a soft, pinkish glow into the room, the exhaustion was profound, but it was a good kind of tired. It was the weariness that comes after a long and arduous journey, the peace of finally arriving at a destination. The emotional storm had passed, leaving behind a clean, quiet stillness. There were no grand declarations, no promises for a future we couldn't yet imagine. There was just a simple, profound agreement. An agreement to be honest. An agreement to be patient. An agreement to not be afraid of the unknown, as long as we were exploring it together. The days that followed were marked by a gentle, deliberate tenderness. The awkwardness was gone, replaced by a quiet intentionality. Touches were no longer accidental. A hand on the small of my back as we passed in the kitchen, fingers lacing together as we sat on the couch, a soft kiss on my temple before he left for work. Each gesture was a reaffirmation, a small, steady brick being laid in the foundation of whatever we were building. His bedroom door, the one that had been such a potent symbol of our division, now remained open, not as a cry for help, but as a simple, unassuming invitation into his life, an invitation that was now fully and freely extended in both directions. We were learning a new language, a new way of being with each other. It was a dance of advance and retreat, of discovering new rhythms. There were moments of shyness, of uncertainty, but they were met with soft smiles and reassuring touches. We were two people who knew each other better than anyone, and yet, we were also starting from the very beginning. I was rediscovering the man I had loved from a distance for years, and this time, I was allowed to get close. I learned the exact shade of green in his eyes when he was happy, the way a small dimple appeared next to his mouth when he was trying not to laugh. And he, in turn, was discovering me, not just as his friend, but as someone who saw him, all of him, and loved him not in spite of his complexities, but because of them. The greatest change was the sleep. He started sleeping through the night, a deep, restful sleep that had eluded him for months. The restless energy that had always clung to him began to dissipate, replaced by a calm, centered presence. His bed no longer felt too big or too empty, because most nights I was in it with him. There was no pretext anymore, no couch, no comforter needed. There was just the simple, uncomplicated truth of wanting to be close to each other. I would lie awake sometimes, just as I had before, but now it was not from a place of anxiety or longing. I would lie there and watch him sleep, his face relaxed and peaceful in the dim light, and I would feel a sense of rightness so profound it was almost overwhelming. It was the feeling of a photograph finally coming into focus, every line sharp, every detail clear. The image I had kept hidden in the dark for so long was finally out in the light, and it was more beautiful than I had ever allowed myself to imagine. One Saturday morning, I woke to the smell of coffee. I opened my eyes and found Liam sitting on the edge of the bed, a mug in each hand. He was already dressed, his hair still damp from the shower. He smiled when he saw I was awake, that easy, brilliant smile that I had first fallen in love with. But this time, it was just for me. It was a private, shared thing, a secret we now held between us. He handed me a mug, his fingers brushing against mine. The warmth of the ceramic seeped into my skin. We sat there for a long time, sipping our coffee in a comfortable, peaceful silence, the morning light streaming through the window. The silence between us was no longer a void to be filled or a tension to be endured. It was a space of its own, a room we had built together, furnished with trust and understanding. It was a quiet harbor, a safe place. It was home. We never really defined what we were. The words, boyfriend, partner, seemed too small, too conventional for the journey we had taken. They belonged to the old map. We were simply Alex and Liam, two people who had found their way back to each other through a fog of fear and misunderstanding. Our relationship was not a destination we had arrived at, but a path we were walking side by side, with no map to guide us but the steady, reassuring presence of the other. We were learning that a home is not always a place with four walls and a roof. Sometimes it is a person. Sometimes it is the quiet, steady sound of a voice in the dark, a voice that can calm the storms inside you and lead you safely to the morning. We had begun to heal in the beautiful, honest silence we had learned to create together, a silence that was no longer empty, but full of the unspoken, undeniable truth of our love.